elite military operations, perception can be everything, and often it's dangerously misleading.
Those first teams were going into the wildest Wild West.
Two world-class counterterrorism units stood side by side, preparing for a joint exercise. Yet, their appearances couldn't have been more different. One exuded tension, intensity, and visible seriousness. The other seemed relaxed, joking quietly, loose in posture, almost flippant. To outsiders, it looked like a mismatch waiting to happen. But among the British SAS was Robin Horsfall, a man who understood that true control, mastery, and readiness are invisible until the moment they are required. In April 1980, 6 Rabbani terrorists took over the Iranian embassy in London, capturing 26 hostages. I'm Robin Horsfall. I was part of the 60-man team that raided the building. What the Americans saw as carelessness was in fact discipline refined to its purest form. A lesson that would challenge assumptions and forever alter how elite forces measure effectiveness. The man behind the legend. One moment, 2 elite units stood shoulder to shoulder, preparing for the same mission. Same target, same rules, same clock ticking down. The next moment, something felt wrong, or rather different. One group tightened up, faces hard, movements sharp and deliberate. The other looked relaxed, a little too relaxed. Jokes whispered under their breath, loose shoulders, no visible tension. To the watching eyes, it looked like a mismatch waiting to happen. That moment is where this story truly begins. Because this was not a demonstration. This was not theater. It was a live counterterrorism exercise designed to expose weaknesses. And the stakes were reputational. Careers had been built and broken in rooms like this. And standing among the British was a man who understood exactly how dangerous underestimation could be. His name was Robin Horsfall. Horsfall did not need to prove anything out loud. He had already learned that the most decisive moments in elite warfare happen before the first move is made. While others measured seriousness by posture and volume, he measured it by silence and restraint. The difference mattered more than anyone realized at the time. What separated the two units was not equipment or physical ability. It was mindset. One believed constant intensity was the only way to stay sharp. The other believed intensity was a resource to be spent only when the moment demanded it. To outsiders, that distinction looked like carelessness. To Horsfall, it was discipline refined to its purest form. As part of the Special Air Service, Horsfall had been shaped by a culture that distrusted theatrics and despised self-importance. There was no appetite for bravado, no interest in looking impressive. Results were the only currency that mattered, and even those were rarely discussed. If something worked, it was done quietly. If it failed, it was owned in private. That attitude would soon put the British at odds with how elite performance was expected to look. The relaxed humor, the apparent indifference, the refusal to perform seriousness on command, all fed a growing assumption across the room. The Delta Force's assumption was simple. These SAS men did not understand the gravity of what they were doing. But Horsfall knew better. He also knew the danger of correcting that belief too early. Let them think what they want. Let them watch. Let them underestimate. Because when perception hardens into certainty, the reversal hits harder. This is why Horsfall has always been uncomfortable with myths. He does not glorify elite units. He dismantles the stories people tell themselves about what competence looks like. Real control does not announce itself. Real confidence does not rush, and real danger rarely looks the way movies prepare us to expect. Soon, a line would be crossed where observation turned into judgment. Quietly and privately, American operators would decide whether the British were reckless amateurs or something far more unsettling. They would base that decision on outcomes, not appearances. And when that moment arrived, everything they thought they knew would be tested. So what happens when the world's most elite soldiers stop judging appearances and start judging outcomes? Why Operation Nimrod changed everything. When the call came in, there was no room for improvisation dressed up as bravery. What followed would be rehearsed, restrained, and brutally precise. The world would later remember the flashes on television and the figures moving through smoke. But that memory was an illusion. The real story of Operation Nimrod happened long before a single camera captured anything at all. The assault on the Iranian embassy was not a gamble. It was the final move in a sequence built on patience. Every angle had been studied. Every possible failure had been discussed and stripped down to its core risks. What the public saw live was only the visible edge of a plan that had been tested, broken, rebuilt, and tested again. The speed looked dramatic because the preparation was invisible. This is where the misunderstanding began. Television compressed hours of control into seconds of action. It made the operation look explosive rather than methodical. But inside professional circles, something else was noticed. The timing was exact. The coordination was silent. There was no hesitation once the decision point was reached. That combination does not come from adrenaline. It comes from discipline under pressure. For the men involved, including operators like Horsfall, the mission was not a spectacle. It was confirmation that restraint could coexist with overwhelming effectiveness. The British approach was rooted in the idea that force should arrive late and leave early. Nothing unnecessary, nothing prolonged. The goal was control, not dominance. Foreign special forces were watching closely, even if the public did not realize it. In the aftermath, units across Europe and North America dissected the operation frame by frame. What stood out was not the breach itself, but the absence of chaos, no shouted commands, no visible panic. Each movement suggested that the operators were several steps ahead of the moment they were in. This forced a quiet reassessment. Until then, British special forces had been respected, but often viewed as conservative and overly traditional. Operation Nimrod challenged that assumption. It showed a unit capable of adapting to modern counterterrorism without sacrificing its core philosophy: preparation over aggression, intelligence over improvisation, psychological control over brute force. Inside American circles, the message landed with particular weight. The United States was still refining its own counterterrorism doctrine. Units like Delta Force were building their identity, studying both failures and successes around the world. Operation Nimrod stood out because it worked under public pressure, political scrutiny, and the most unforgiving variable of all, live broadcast. What many missed was that the cameras changed nothing for the SAS. The same standards applied whether the world was watching or not. That consistency was the real signal being sent. It suggested a depth of institutional confidence that could not be faked. From that point on, the British were no longer just a historical benchmark. They became a contemporary reference. Quietly, without announcements or rivalries, the SAS entered the internal conversations of other elite units. Later, when joint training brought these forces face to face, assumptions formed quickly. Appearances always do that. But what the Delta Force would eventually see in those sessions challenged every assumption that had made about the SAS. The first encounters SAS meets Delta Force. Fort Bragg was not a place that celebrated first impressions. Everything about it communicated seriousness. Movements were clipped. Voices stayed low. Schedules were rigid down to the minute. This was where America's most secretive counterterrorism unit trained to remove uncertainty from violence. When the British arrived for joint exercises, the contrast was immediate and unsettling. Delta Force operators carried themselves with relentless intensity. Gear was checked and rechecked. Briefings were formal, stripped of humor, and delivered with the gravity of real-world consequences. There was an unspoken rule that nothing here was casual. Every gesture mattered. Every second was a test. Into that environment walked the men of the SAS, and they broke the serious rhythm without even trying. The British laughed. They cracked jokes during downtime. Their body language was loose, almost dismissive. Some leaned against walls during briefings. Others exchanged dry remarks that sounded dangerously close to sarcasm. To American eyes, it looked like indiscipline. Worse, it looked like a lack of respect for the mission. One Delta operator later summed up the feeling bluntly. "We thought they were taking the piss." The humor was dark, understated, and constant. It did not shut off when the exercise began. Even during rehearsals, the British seemed oddly relaxed. There was no visible switch from casual to combat ready. That absence of a clear on-off signal bothered the Americans. In Delta Force culture, intensity was the signal. If you were not visibly switched on, you were not ready. The early judgment was harsh. The SAS appeared flippant. Their planning sessions felt shorter. Their questions were fewer. They did not debate every contingency out loud. To Delta, this looked like corners being cut. A few operators quietly wondered how the British had built their reputation in the first place. But something did not add up. Despite their casual exterior, the SAS never missed a timing window. They never forgot a detail that mattered. Their gear was always where it needed to be. When scenarios shifted unexpectedly, they adjusted without visible stress. There was no scramble, no raised voices, and no spike in tension. That contradiction began to attract attention. Delta Force started watching more closely, not openly, not confrontationally, just quietly observing patterns. Who checked what? Who spoke when things went wrong? Who stayed silent? Surveillance was not formal, but it was constant. The Americans wanted to understand whether this was genuine looseness or an act designed to throw people off. The confusion deepened. The British did not react the way Delta expected under pressure. Where Americans tightened up, the SAS seemed to slow down. Where Delta raised intensity, the British appeared to narrow their focus. It was the opposite of everything Delta had been taught to value. Still, the surface impression remained dominant. The jokes never stopped. The posture never hardened. There was no visible transformation into something more serious. For a unit trained to read threat through behavior, this was alarming. By the time the final joint exercises were scheduled, a quiet consensus had begun to form among the Americans. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated. Perhaps Operation Nimrod had been a perfect storm rather than a reflection of a smart strategy-driven system. Perhaps the SAS had simply gotten lucky once. In private conversations, the word incompetent was never spoken aloud, but it hovered in the background. And that belief, once formed, would make what came next far more shocking than anyone at Fort Bragg was prepared for. The misjudgment when humor looked like weakness. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine drill. Inside a mock kill house, operators were told to run through movement patterns using training weapons. The Americans approached it with full intensity, faces set, bodies tight, and every step deliberate. The British walked in carrying water pistols. It was not a mistake. It was not disrespect. It was deliberate. Laughter rippled through the SAS group as they moved through the rooms, calling out angles, marking threats, and flowing through doorways with bright plastic toys in their hands. To the Delta Force, it looked like mockery. Months of preparation reduced to a joke. The assumption hardened instantly. These men did not take the craft seriously, but the water pistols were never the point. They were a signal to each other. The SAS philosophy was built around conservation. Emotional energy mattered. Adrenaline was not something to bathe in constantly. It was a limited resource to be released only when the situation demanded absolute speed and violence. Everything else was practice, rehearsal, mental mapping. The weapon, real or fake, was secondary to positioning, timing, and communication. American doctrine leaned in the opposite direction. Delta Force trained at a constant pitch of readiness. The switch was always on. Every drill was treated as if it might suddenly become real. That approach built sharpness through repetition under stress, and it created a visible seriousness that outsiders learned to respect. However, the British did not play by that game. They refused to perform intensity for its own sake. To them, constant tension dulled reaction time. It made mistakes more likely when the real moment arrived. Calm was not the absence of readiness. It was the foundation of it. Delta Force did not see it that way. From their perspective, the SAS appeared arrogant. They acted as if the environment did not matter. They joked in places where focus was expected. They seemed to rely on reputation rather than effort. The line between confidence and carelessness looked dangerously thin. What frustrated the Americans most was that the British did not correct the misunderstanding. No explanations were offered. No philosophy was defended. The SAS did not justify themselves. They simply continued as they were. That silence was intentional. Operators like Horsfall understood that performance explained nothing until the moment it mattered. Words were cheap. Demonstrations were permanent. If the Americans wanted seriousness, they would see it soon enough. By allowing the perception to stand, the British gained something invaluable. They were underestimated. Expectations dropped. Pressure shifted away from them and onto their hosts. Delta Force believed they were about to carry the weight of the final evaluation. The atmosphere changed as the last joint exercise approached. This would not be a rehearsal. It would be a full-scale scenario with observers, timing benchmarks, and performance reviews. The kind of test that settled arguments without debate. Delta Force entered the planning phase, confident and coiled. The SAS entered quietly, still joking, still loose, still unreadable. To the Americans, the outcome seemed obvious. They had no idea that the British were about to switch on everything they had been holding back. 6 seconds that changed Delta Force's opinion. The final exercise began without ceremony, no speeches, no hype, just a target building, a simulated hostage scenario, and a clock that would not wait for explanations. Observers lined the perimeter. Evaluators checked their watches. Delta Force stood ready, confident in what they believed was about to unfold. The SAS did not look any different than they had all week. No visible shift, no hard stares, no sudden seriousness. If anything, they looked almost bored. That alone reinforced what some of the Americans already believed. Then the signal was given, and what happened next unfolded so fast, it barely registered as action. The British moved as one shape rather than a group of individuals. Doors opened and cleared in a single flowing motion. No shouted commands, no overlapping movement. Each operator seemed to already know where the others would be without needing to look. The rhythm was not frantic, it was smooth. The first room was secured before the observers could grasp what they were seeing. By the time the Delta Force realized something was wrong with their expectations, the scenario was already collapsing in the SAS's favor. Hostile targets were neutralized with mechanical precision. Corners were dominated instantly. There was no pause between decisions. Every action flowed into the next like a rehearsed sequence, except this had never been rehearsed in that exact form. They thought we were idiots until we did this. Horsfall recalled, the Americans had us pegged as careless, joking around, and unprepared. Then the exercise started. 6 seconds from entry to securing the hostages, the building was cleared. No chaos, no shouting, every movement precise, every decision instant. In that moment, they realized it wasn't luck and it wasn't theatrics. It was training, discipline, and trust. That's when the entire room changed their opinion of us. 6 seconds. That was all it took from entry to extraction. 6 seconds to locate, secure, and remove the hostages. 6 seconds without hesitation. 6 seconds without chaos. 6 seconds with no wasted motion. No cross lines, and no visible friction. The SAS exited the building as calmly as they had entered it. Then came the silence. The laughter that had followed them all week was gone. The casual dismissals evaporated. The Delta Force operators stood still, replaying what they had just seen, trying to reconcile it with the assumptions they had carried into the exercise. Shock came first, not because of speed alone, but because of how little effort it appeared to take. The British had not forced the outcome. They had allowed it to happen by being in the right place at the right time. Silence followed. No immediate critiques, no bravado, no attempts to downplay the result. Professionals recognized professionalism when they see it, and what they had just witnessed did not fit any category they were comfortable with. Then came respect. In that moment, the Delta Force understood what they had been misreading all along. The humor was not unseriousness. It was pressure control. The jokes were not distractions. They were release valves. The looseness was not laziness. It was confidence born from repetition so deep it no longer needed conscious effort. And the silence before action was not a lack of readiness. It was discipline refined to the point where nothing extra was required. Operators like Robin Horsfall had never planned to explain any of this. They did not believe explanation mattered. Performance was the only language that carried weight between elite units. In those 6 seconds, that language had been spoken fluently. The Americans began to ask different questions after that. Not how fast the SAS were, not how aggressive, but how they maintained such clarity under pressure, how they avoided emotional spikes, how they conserved energy until it mattered most. The answers were uncomfortable because they challenged deeply held beliefs. Constant intensity was not the only path to readiness. Loud confidence was not required. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the room were the ones who appeared least invested until the exact moment investment became unavoidable. From that point on, the British were no longer underestimated. What the Delta Force really thought of the SAS. After the exercise, nothing was said publicly. There were no announcements, no congratulatory speeches, and no formal acknowledgements. But inside closed rooms, the conversation changed completely. Delta Force officers did not describe the SAS as lucky or flashy. They used different words, ones that carried more weight. Unconventional was the first, not unconventional in tactics alone, but in temperament. The British did not behave the way elite units were expected to behave. They did not chase validation. They did not perform seriousness. They operated according to an internal rhythm that did not need approval from outside observers. Radically adaptable was the second. Delta Force had trained extensively for known variables. The SAS appeared comfortable operating in the unknown. When conditions shifted, they did not react. They absorbed the change and flowed through it. That ability made them difficult to plan against, even in a training environment. The third description was the most telling. Dangerous in ways doctrine could not predict. This was not a compliment. Offered lightly. Doctrine is the backbone of American military culture. It creates reliability at scale. But the Delta Force officers recognized that the SAS mindset did not scale easily, and that was precisely the problem. It was built around individuals who could be trusted to make decisions without guidance, without reinforcement, and without reassurance. Robin Horsfall later explained why this approach was so hard to replicate. American units operated within a massive system. Even elite formations were shaped by structure, oversight, and institutional expectation. The British system was smaller, quieter, and more selective. It allowed for a different kind of freedom. Selection played a crucial role. The SAS filtered not just for physical ability, but for psychological independence. Candidates were expected to operate alone for long periods, make decisions in isolation, and live with the consequences without external validation that created operators who did not need constant feedback to perform. Size mattered as well. Horsfall was clear on this point. Special elite units had to stay small. Once a unit grew beyond a certain point, it became harder to preserve trust, discretion, and autonomy. The SAS resisted expansion precisely because it diluted the very qualities that made it effective. Delta Force understood this tension intimately. They faced pressures the British did not. Larger operational demands, broader global reach, political oversight. Yet that did not prevent respect from forming. If anything, it deepened it. There was no rivalry after Fort Bragg, only recognition. The Americans did not see the SAS as technically superior. They saw them as psychologically unpredictable. That unpredictability was not chaos. It was control without visible structure. It made the British difficult to read, difficult to model, and difficult to counter. In modern warfare, where rigid plans collapse under uncertainty, that mindset has only grown more relevant. Conflicts no longer unfold along clean lines. Decisions are made in fragmented environments under ambiguous authority with incomplete information. The Delta Force learned something valuable from that encounter. Effectiveness does not always look impressive. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it looks arrogant. And sometimes it walks into a room with a water pistol and leaves 6 seconds later with the outcome already decided. And that lesson still echoes today. The final truth. Why this still matters. The most dangerous soldiers in the world do not look dangerous at all until the moment everything changes. Robin Horsfall insists that myth clouds understanding. Legends grow and people assume elite performance must be flashy or obvious. In reality, true elite soldiers operate quietly, controlled, and invisible until action is required. Crisis, leadership, and modern warfare are not defined by constant motion. They are defined by patience, precision, and psychological mastery. Delta Force learned that unpredictability, adaptability, and calmness under pressure outweigh rigid drills or constant intensity. Size does not equal effectiveness. Small, disciplined, and confident units outperform larger, more obvious forces every time. The lesson applies far beyond the battlefield. Crisis response, strategic decision-making, and human judgment cannot rely on appearances. Mastery often looks ordinary until the decisive moments arrive. 6 seconds can rewrite opinions, dismantle assumptions, and force even the most skeptical observers to acknowledge true excellence. Horsfall's principle is simple. Select the man, train the man, and trust the man. This approach transcends military doctrine. It guides leadership in high-stakes environments, innovation under pressure, and any situation where outcomes cannot be predicted by observation alone. Elite performance is subtle, controlled, and intentionally invisible until it strikes with precision.